A strike that unfolded not over several weeks, but in a matter of hours. Hours that obliterated one of Russia's most strategically significant military installations. Hours that sent shockwaves through Moscow's defense establishment. Hours that left Vladimir Putin scrambling for explanations and demanding heads roll. What Ukraine did today crossed a line that the Kremlin had hoped would hold, and when that line broke, Moscow did not respond with strength. They responded with panic, deflection, and blame. For weeks, Ukraine's drone capabilities have been evolving, becoming more sophisticated, more lethal, and more unpredictable. But what happened in the early hours of this morning was something different entirely. It was not just an attack, it was a humiliation. And when a humiliation of this magnitude lands on Vladimir Putin's doorstep, someone must answer for it. Tonight we're going to break down exactly what Ukraine struck, why it matters, and why the Kremlin's decision to blame its own generals tells us more about the state of this war than any battlefield report ever could. For several months now there had been signals, not from official channels, not from formal intelligence briefings, just signals that Ukraine was preparing something unprecedented. Ukraine has been aggressive, yes, but they have been calculated in their aggression. Their drone strikes have followed a certain logic, a pattern, almost a doctrine. They target ammunition depots when stockpiles peak. They hit fuel reserves before major offensives. They strike command posts when intelligence confirms high-value personnel. But what set off alarm bells in Western defense circles this week was that the pattern went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Ukrainian drone activity know the indicators, the procurement of specific components, the repositioning of launch teams, the unusual quiet in communications chatter, the sudden reduction in smaller tactical strikes. All of that went quiet, and whenever Ukraine goes quiet, it means something significant is about to get loud. Russia, for its part, had been projecting confidence. State media ran segments about upgraded air defense systems. Military bloggers claimed that new electronic warfare capabilities had neutralized Ukrainian drones in recent tests. Putin himself, speaking at a defense exhibition just last week, boasted that Russia's skies were impenetrable. That boast aged poorly, very poorly. Early this morning, satellite monitoring services detected what they described as multiple thermal signatures consistent with sustained explosions, including secondary detonations that had not been observed at this facility in over 18 months. These are the kinds of signatures that indicate not a glancing blow but a direct, penetrating strike, one that reached ammunition storage, fuel reserves, or critical infrastructure. These are the kinds of strikes that Ukraine only executes when they have precise intelligence, favorable conditions, and absolute confidence in their targeting. Intelligence analysts didn't know initially whether this was a tactical disruption, a strategic degradation, or a political message. What they did know was that Ukraine was changing the calculus of this war. And when a nation fighting for its survival shifts tactics this dramatically, even by a small measure, every major power pays attention. The target, as we would learn within hours, was the Morozovsk Air Base, a critical installation in Russia's Rostov region that houses bomber squadrons, attack aircraft, and most importantly, stockpiles of the glide bombs that have devastated Ukrainian cities. This was not a random target. This was the heart of Russia's aerial terror campaign. The reaction from the Kremlin tonight was not normal. It was not measured, it was not controlled, it was frantic. Source after source inside Moscow described Putin's response as furious, bewildered, and perhaps most importantly, deeply embarrassed. Russian state media initially attempted its usual playbook: downplay the damage, blame Western provocations, and assure viewers that air defense systems performed admirably. But that narrative collapsed within hours. Videos emerged showing massive fireballs illuminating the night sky. Local residents reported explosions that lasted for over 40 minutes, and satellite imagery confirmed what Ukraine had been claiming: multiple aircraft destroyed, ammunition bunkers obliterated, and infrastructure damage that will take months to repair. Russia's strategy of information control only works if the target audience doesn't see the truth. Tonight everyone saw the truth. Ukraine's drone fleet had penetrated one of Russia's most defended air bases, evaded or overwhelmed air defense systems that cost billions to deploy, and destroyed assets that cannot be quickly replaced. Here's what we know. Within 3 hours of the initial strikes, the Kremlin summoned emergency meetings with defense ministry officials. These weren't routine briefings, these were crisis sessions, the kind that only happen when something has gone catastrophically wrong. And by midday Moscow time, the first reports of generals being blamed began leaking to state-adjacent media channels. Tonight, Ukrainian military intelligence confirmed that their forces launched a coordinated drone swarm operation targeting the Morozovsk Air Base, including aircraft shelters that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was protection against exactly this type of attack. Ukraine struck before Russia could adapt. They hit Su-34 fighter bombers, the aircraft responsible for dropping glide bombs on Kharkiv. They hit ammunition storage bunkers containing those same glide bombs. They hit fuel depots that were likely preparing to support a new wave of bombing runs. In other words, Ukraine targeted the entire kill chain of Russia's aerial bombardment campaign. The aircraft that carry the bombs themselves, the fuel that makes it operational. This is what made the strike so devastating. Russia's glide bomb campaign wasn't just disrupted, it was degraded at every level. It represented the kind of blow that could shift air superiority dynamics if left unaddressed. And Russia, understanding that fully, is now scrambling to respond. Not strategically, not calmly, but desperately. They didn't acknowledge the damage honestly. They didn't reassure their pilots with facts. They blamed their own commanders. They threw their generals under the bus. The Kremlin's response tells us everything we need to know about how badly this hurt. When authoritarian regimes succeed, leaders take credit. When they fail, they find scapegoats. Tonight, Vladimir Putin found his scapegoats. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Western intelligence analysts now believe that Russia's recent posturing, the boasts about impenetrable air defenses, the dismissive comments about Ukrainian capabilities was designed to test the confidence of Ukraine's military planners after months of grueling ground combat. Russia wanted to see whether Ukraine would scale back its long-range operations, whether they would conserve resources, whether they would hesitate. But instead, the opposite happened. Ukraine didn't hesitate. They launched an operation that was so bold, so meticulously planned, that even Russian military bloggers were forced to acknowledge its effectiveness. You don't get Russia's attention easily. Their state media apparatus is designed to ignore inconvenient truths. But today, Ukraine broke through that wall. Defense analysts speaking with Western media under anonymity described Russia's response as displacement behavior, a way to redirect internal anger, away from systemic failures and toward individual commanders. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and unpredictable. Their drone swarms were not only effective, they were coordinated so precisely that multiple targets were struck simultaneously, overwhelming Russia's layered air defense systems. That simultaneity matters because it shows doctrinal evolution. It shows that Ukraine is not merely reacting to Russian aggression. They are shaping the battlefield. They are dictating terms. As reports continued coming in throughout the day, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's operation. Ukrainian drone units carried out at least 40 individual strikes, forcing Russian air defense systems to engage targets across multiple vectors simultaneously. Specialized attack drones targeted aircraft shelters that had been hardened in the last 6 months. Electronic warfare teams operating from undisclosed positions reportedly jammed Russian communication frequencies used by air defense coordinators. This wasn't just harassment, this wasn't just attrition, this was operational art. This was strategic degradation, and strategic degradation is the one thing Russia has struggled to prevent since the first months of this war. For every defensive improvement they have made, Ukraine has countered with innovation that renders those improvements insufficient. New air defense radars, Ukraine adapts flight profiles. Hardened shelters, Ukraine develops more powerful warheads. Electronic warfare, Ukraine implements autonomous targeting. The pattern is clear: Russia reacts, Ukraine evolves. And tonight that evolution was on full display. Remember, Vladimir Putin thought this war would last days. He thought Kiev would fall within 72 hours. He thought Ukraine's military would collapse, its government would flee, and the West would issue strongly worded statements before moving on. He thought wrong, but tonight the exact opposite of everything Putin planned is happening. Ukraine is striking deeper into Russia than ever before. Russia's air force is losing aircraft it cannot replace, and the Kremlin is blaming its own military leadership for failures that stem from Putin's own strategic miscalculations. 3 years into what was supposed to be a 3-day operation, Russia is not projecting strength, it is projecting dysfunction. What makes this moment so consequential and so revealing is that Putin's humiliation happened at a time when the Russian president is under extraordinary domestic pressure. Military hardliners want more aggressive escalation, economic pragmatists want resource conservation, regional governors want their conscripted sons returned home, nationalist bloggers want accountability for repeated failures. Putin is balancing these demands while fighting a war that has cost Russia over 300,000 casualties, decimated its professional military class, and isolated its economy from the global financial system. And when leaders in that position suffer public humiliations, they don't respond rationally. They respond from pressure, they respond from vulnerability, they respond by finding someone to blame. Tonight that someone was Russia's Air Force commander and several base defense coordinators. Reports indicate that at least 3 senior officers have been relieved of command, not because they failed to follow orders, but because they failed to achieve the impossible, defend against a threat that Russia's leadership had publicly dismissed as insignificant. The Kremlin statement, now circulating through state media channels, was designed to signal that Russian leadership is not willing to accept responsibility for systemic failures. Officials said plainly that the base commander's performance was inconsistent with the standards expected of Russian military professionals. That is diplomatic language for, "We are sacrificing these men to protect Putin's image." You don't usually hear this tone from the Kremlin unless something serious is at stake. Internal legitimacy, military morale, the perception of competence that authoritarian regimes depend upon for survival. All of it was threatened tonight. And the Kremlin's response, blame the generals, punish the commanders, deny systemic problems, is a textbook authoritarian deflection. It may work domestically in the short term. It will not fix the problems that made this strike possible. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed his nation in a measured, resolute speech tonight. He said every bomb that Russia cannot drop is a life we have saved. He said we will continue to defend our skies by ensuring our enemies cannot take off. And he said this is what happens when a nation fighting for freedom refuses to accept limits imposed by aggressors. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a wartime leader who understands just how high the stakes have become and how important it is to demonstrate that Ukraine can project power into Russian territory. For months, debates have raged about whether Ukraine should be permitted to strike inside Russia. Tonight, Ukraine answered that question with action, and the answer was unambiguous. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning for Moscow. Ukraine's strike on Morozovsk wasn't isolated. Along with the main attack, Ukrainian naval drones also reportedly targeted a Russian supply vessel in the Black Sea. Partisan networks claimed responsibility for disrupting rail lines supplying the southern military district. Cyber operations increased against Russian logistics management systems. All of this happened within the same 24-hour period. When Ukraine moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. This appears to be a coordinated campaign, not a single strike, but an offensive designed to degrade Russia's ability to conduct aerial bombardment while simultaneously disrupting supply chains. If this pattern continues, Russia will face difficult choices about resource allocation, force positioning, and defensive priorities, and every difficult choice Russia makes is a choice Ukraine has forced upon them. Western analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Ukraine is preparing for a major ground operation and wants to neutralize Russian air support before it begins. Another is that Ukraine is attempting to demonstrate capability to Western allies ahead of critical aid decisions. A third possibility, the one worrying Russian military planners the most, is that Ukraine is attempting to establish a new normal, where strikes deep inside Russia become routine rather than exceptional. But today, Russia's assumption of sanctuary was shattered. Ukraine didn't merely protest glide bomb attacks on their cities. They didn't simply request Western intervention. They didn't wait for permission. They eliminated the problem at its source. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Russia wants to see whether Ukraine will sustain this level of pressure or revert to defensive operations. Ukraine wants to show that no Russian military installation is beyond reach. Western allies want to prevent escalation while supporting Ukrainian self-defense, and Putin wants to prevent further humiliation while maintaining domestic control. These objectives are not compatible. Something will have to give, and tonight it was Russia that gave. Tonight we've heard from satellite imagery analysts who are now assessing damage across the Morozovsk facility. They say at least 4 aircraft appear destroyed beyond repair. They say secondary explosions continued for hours after the initial strike, suggesting ammunition cook-off. And they say Russia's decision to blame base commanders is likely part of an internal narrative management strategy intended to insulate Putin from criticism. But Ukraine is not intimidated. In fact, Ukraine is emboldened. Their strike today, precise, devastating, and psychologically impactful, sent a message to Russia that sanctuary no longer exists, and it sent a message to the West that Ukraine can use advanced capabilities responsibly and effectively. As the coming days unfold, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Russia hoped to achieve with its glide bomb campaign and how significantly tonight's strike has disrupted those plans. But what we do know is that Ukraine's operation was timely. It degraded Russia's ability to terrorize Ukrainian cities. It demonstrated that Ukrainian innovation continues to outpace Russian adaptation. And it exposed the dysfunction at the heart of Russia's military command structure. What happens next will depend on what Putin does in the next 72 hours. If he escalates recklessly, he risks further exposing Russian vulnerabilities. If he accepts the loss and adapts, Ukraine has already demonstrated they are ready to strike again. They have shown they are ready to respond. They have shown they will not be terrorized into submission. And tonight, for the first time in months, Vladimir Putin appears to be genuinely uncertain. The Kremlin is quiet, too quiet. And when Putin is quiet, it means he is calculating. It means he is weighing options that have no good outcomes. Because tonight Putin learned something he has learned many times since February 2022. Underestimating Ukraine is a catastrophic mistake. Boasting about invincibility invites humiliation, and blaming generals doesn't fix the failures that made their defeat inevitable. This story is far from over, but tonight one thing is clear. Ukraine has proven that distance provides no protection for Russian military assets. The Kremlin's response reveals weakness, not strength. And Vladimir Putin's humiliation will not be forgotten by his enemies abroad or his critics at home, and we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.